Welcome back. This is the second part of the Module 1 on biodiversity in our environmental sustainability section. So in our first part we reviewed some of the basic concepts of ecology, and I hope you're familiar and feel comfortable using some of the terms like ecosystem, species, and ecological niche, because they'll become important in the next part of the course. Simply stated, biodiversity is all the varied forms of life that occur in a place or in the world. Biodiversity could be defined, can be divided and subdivided into different layers. So for example, one of the layers that you can look at in terms of biodiversity and its definition are all the different organisms and varied kinds of organisms that can be found in a place. This includes all the genetic types and different species, subspecies, and ecotypes that exist within that place. So as we saw with the caribou, you can have a species that divides into an ecotype or subspecies and that is genetically different from one another. It's important to include the genetic differences that exist within species and within groups of species, because those things are things that provide the potential for adaptation and change. If an environment changes, or if there is some alteration in terms of the nutrients that flow into a system, or if there's some change in terms of the other organisms that come into a community, the ability to adapt is directly related to the variability that's out there. One of the great achievements of biology has been understanding how adaptation arrives, and it arises as a result of the survival and reproduction of those individuals that do better under certain conditions. And if the ability to do better is related to the ability to inherit genes that allow you to do better, then over time what will happen is the genetic makeup of populations and species changes. And as it changes, it becomes better suited to the kinds of environments that it has encountered, and that change towards a better suiting of the environment to an environment is what of as adaptation. And so in addition to the organisms and their varied forms and the genetics that allows for that variation to express itself over time in evolution, what we also have are a variety of different ecological features on landscapes, such as watersheds and ecosystems and habitats and different communities themselves. So a variety of different communities lead to a variety of different species that live within them, and within those different interactions could be had that would lead to different levels of genetic variability. So all of those different things, the ecological features in a place, the genetic variability within the organisms that are in that place, and the organisms themselves can all be thought of as the components that make up biodiversity. You can ask whether or not there are any global patterns of biodiversity in the world, and indeed there are. When you take a look at where there are the greatest numbers of different species and different ecosystems and genetic variety, you tend to find that they are associated with areas surrounding the equator and near oceans, where you get the greatest productivity of plants as a result of the most consistent sunlight that comes in, and also the most available water due to the kinds of flows of that material around equatorial regions. And so diversity tends to follow certain kinds of gradients. Levels of diversity tend to be higher in the tropics than they are in the temperate areas and polar regions of the world. They tend to be higher at the bottoms of mountains than at the tops of mountains. And there are a number of general rules that define diversity and where diversity is highest. Many of the processes are still being discussed in the scientific literature about why those patterns exist, but they're rather clear patterns. And they also play out on a local scale. So, for example, you can find lots of variability in areas like riparian areas and landscapes. And so places where you find the same conditions of higher temperature and greater water and thus higher levels of productivity, that productivity can support a much more varied community of organisms because individuals can specialize on different parts of a plant. For example, the leaves, stems, and roots could all have different beetles that would be specialists on them as a result of the competition in the past that led to specialize on those resources. So at least locally, when you take a look at it, the rangelands that we have around us in the central part of British Columbia are able to support a relatively high level of diversity, in part because of the productivity that the grasses in those rangelands have. They act as very effective sinks for the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and they can tie up carbon dioxide in the productivity of their bodies. That in addition to those sorts of reasons for the productivity of these local rangelands, we have natural disturbances, especially fire, that can set things into different stages of their successional histories, so that at some point a very hot fire can burn right down to the mineral soil, whereas cooler fires set and occurring at different times of the year may actually have a greater amount of material on the ground from which seeds can take root and start. So in these different areas, this natural rangelands actually have wonderful levels of biodiversity, and on the scale of the size of a few parking spaces, you can actually find a huge variety of different plant types in natural healthy grassland habitats. Other things, as I said, occur on these habitats are landscape features such as wetlands and other specific microhabitats as a result of the historical events that have shaped the shape of that land, such as the glaciation that often occurs in the grasslands around the middle part of British Columbia. And the soils that exist there too are the consequence of the history of events that have deposited those soils in different locations. You'll learn more about that in other segments of the course. But I think the bottom line is that when you get variation in habitats and features on the landscape and disturbances that occur there, they all act to generate different varieties of organisms and produce this biodiversity that is characteristic of different places. So why is biodiversity important? Well, there's been a lot of work on that as well, theoretically and practically, in the ecological literature. And there's a few, I think, generalities that come out that are probably the most important ones anyway. One thing is that diverse systems, ones that have lots of different species in them, tend to be more resilient and resistant to change than our more simplified ones. We see this mostly in agriculture, but you see it due to the result of other chance events over time. So, for example, in agriculture, most of the varieties of wheat that we have come from only a very small number of varieties, most of which were developed in Manitoba. And when you get into a wheat field or in a corn field, what you have is a monoculture of different individual plants, but they're all very closely related genetically. Without that genetic variety, what happens is frequently a disease organism can catch hold, and if it's successful in one individual, it'll be successful in every individual in the entire population. And so variety allows the escape from some of those diseases or other kinds of events that would happen to run wild in a monoculture or something that lacked that genetic diversity. And as I pointed out before, diverse systems, especially genetic diverse systems are able to adapt to more long-term environmental changes, things like general cooling of the environment. If there is a lack of genetic diversity in the population, the opportunity for adaptation to occur through natural selection simply isn't there. And the other importance of obtaining systems as diverse systems is that diversity produces for diverse direct benefits of ecosystems. So, for example, diverse systems provide diverse ranges of food for us and for our animals, and historically as sources for medicines as well. The world and nature has done an enormous number of experiments with the chemicals that are the building blocks of life. And many of the medicines that we find and that we use have had their origins in these organic experiments over the last many millions of years to ensure that there's some form that has been able to defeat the weaponry, if you wish, of an insect. And so a plant that has a particular chemical in it may have used that chemical to defeat and ward off a predatory insect, but that same chemical may have other activities that can work in as a medicinal ingredient. And so much of our traditions have come about as a result of discovering these functional aspects of the diversity that exists within ecosystems. And diverse ecosystems also provide other, what you can think of as indirect benefits as well, in the form of what was ecosystem services. Simple systems lack some of the ability to cleanse air and water supplies and to provide the kinds of things that allow other forms of life to exist on the planet. And so in many different respects, from being more resistant and resilient to change to providing direct and indirect benefits to us, diverse systems are valued, and leads us into our second assignment. So here's what I'd like to suggest as a second assignment. It'll be based on two different readings that I've found that are particularly good with regard to this subject of ecosystem services. And the question that I want you to answer is, what are the most important ecosystem services provided by properly functioning rangelands? In order to do this, and it'll be more summary than an essay, what I'd like you to do is to read two papers, one that is a biodiversity issues paper, and another one that, again, looks specifically at ecosystem services. And so I'll ask you to read those two papers and write a 1 to 2 page summary of some of their major findings. Group them together a little bit differently than what they've done there, and be careful not to just plagiarize. Cutting and pasting isn't a good idea, but try and put them in your own words. And so this will be due on May 4th.